Hey, what is going on guys? RvzStealth here, and in today's video, we're going to be taking a look and breaking down why Ezreal jungle has started to see a lot more play recently. A lot of pro players and a lot of players in general have started to pick this up in solo queue. It was even played in a professional match. I'm pretty sure it got played in the LPL. So in this video, we're just going to break down why it's actually a viable pick and how you should look to play it in the early game. So that being said guys, let's get started. So first here, we're going to take a look at why it's a viable pick and how you should look to play it. And then at the end of the video, we're going to go over the build, the runes, and the masteries for Ezreal jungle. So the first reason here to why Ezreal jungle is viable is because you don't actually need to build tier on Ezreal jungle. You're going to be getting blue buff every single time. You're not going to have to worry about your team taking that blue buff because you are the jungler. With AD carry Ezreal right now, having to build tier, it just gives you a very weak early to mid game. You don't really start to pick up and you don't start to deal damage until like the 25 to 30 minute point. But with this Ezreal jungle, you're going to build warrior, and then after that you're going to pick up a Sheen and then Trinity Force, and you're going to have a much earlier power spike with Ezreal jungle, and you can do a lot more in the early game with this pick as opposed to if you're playing AD carry Ezreal. And then also, this is where the buff to his Q comes into play, because if you are going warrior on Ezreal, you're going to be getting a lot of AD in the early game. When you play Ezreal as an AD carry or in the AD carry role, you don't usually build a whole lot of AD in the early game. You build Trinity Force, you build Manamune, and those two items don't give you a whole lot of AD. But with this Ezreal jungle, going warrior, you're going to benefit a lot more from those Q buffs, and your Q is actually going to do quite a bit more damage in the early game. Now, one of the major reasons to why this works really well is because Ezreal jungle has one of the fastest early clears in the game for any champion. He can reach level 3 at around 2 minutes and 20 seconds, which is absolutely insane. Not a lot of other junglers, or I'm pretty sure there's no other jungler that can clear faster than Ezreal. The standard clear, or the level 3 clear on Ezreal if you are on blue side, is you'd go red buff, you go blue buff, and then you do your Gromp, and your level 3 by around the 2 minute and 20, 2 minute 30 second mark, depending on how well you kite. And then after that, you can either look to go for an invade, and you can also look to just go for an early gank and surprise the enemy because they probably won't be expecting a gank that early on into the game. You can also go for a bit of extra cheese on this pick to where you start your red buff and you immediately gank mid lane after you take red. You level up your E, you E onto the enemy mid laner, you start applying that red buff, and you're almost guaranteed to burn the enemy's flash. I would use this route, the red buff, into a gank route if your mid laner is a very snowbally mid laner, or if they do have a very strong early game and they're a pick that can really do a lot with a little bit of early jungle pressure. If your mid laner isn't someone though that can really snowball super hard in the mid lane, say they're playing someone like Galio and the enemy mid laner also has a gap closer, then in that situation I'd probably just go for like the level 3 route. But if you really want to try to get your mid lane ahead and just get a snowball going super quickly, then I would use that level 2 red buff into a mid lane gank route. You can also go for another route to where you take blue, Gromp, wolves, and then you look to make a play at level 3. There's a lot of different jungle routes that you can do on this Ezreal jungle, and it just kind of depends what you want to look for in the early game. If you want to, for example, if you want to snowball top lane, then you'd probably go for a blue, Gromp, red, gank top lane. If you want to snowball mid lane, then you go red buff mid. It just really does depend on the game and what you're looking to achieve. In order to make this jungle Ezreal pick work though, you need to be aggressive in the early game. You can't just be farming your jungle. You need to be actively looking to invade the enemy jungler or just gank a lot in the early game. Ezreal's dueling potential at level 3 is actually surprisingly good with the red buff. You're going to take 2 points into your Q, a point into your E, and as long as you can hit your Qs on the opponent and kite well with your E and red buff, then there's not a lot of other junglers in the game that can actually outduel an Ezreal at level 3. His ganks are also not that bad in the early game with his E and the red buff, so if you hard farm on this champion, you're gonna be pretty useless. Make sure you play aggressive in the early game, make sure you're active around the map, because that's how you're gonna win on this pick in this patch. Now, as for your setup here on Ezreal jungle for the item build, the skill order, the runes, and the masteries, your build is going to look like getting a machete in the early game, transitioning either into the blue smite or the red smite, depending on your matchup. Some players are going blue smite if they're up against an enemy jungler that isn't the best duelist in the early game. If the enemy jungler is playing someone though, like a Kha'Zix or a Lee Sin that is also a great dueling jungler, then I would go for the red smite in that situation. After you finish your warrior, going for Trinity Force and then a Blade of the Ruined King is the most common build in this patch. Some people are going for a Duskblade as their third item instead of the Blade of the Ruined King. With the Q buffs, getting all that AD from the Duskblade is going to mean your Q will do quite a bit more damage in this patch, so I think Bork and Duskblade are both viable options. It just does depend on the enemy team comp. If they are a very squishy team comp and they're not stacking health or armor, then I would go for the Duskblade, but if they are a more tanky team comp, then I would go for the Blade of the Ruined King as your third item. Now for boots on Ezreal jungle, because you get the 10% CDR from the warrior, you get 20% from Trinity Force, and you're also getting some from your runes, you don't need to go CDR boots on Ezreal jungle, so you can go, depending on the situation, either ninja tabis, you can go for the attack speed boots as well. It just does depend on the situation and how the game is going. For the skill order on Ezreal, it's pretty standard. Q max first, E max second, and then W last, and obviously take your ult whenever you can. For the runes on Ez jungle, this is the page that most pro players are running on him right now, so it's 9 AD marks, 3 attack speed glyphs, 6 CDR glyphs, so that you do get 35% CDR by running this page, and by getting warrior and Trinity Force, by the mid game, you're gonna have that 35% CDR, which is really nice on Ezreal. You're taking 5 health per level seals, 4 armor seals, and 3 attack speed quints. And then for the masteries on Ezreal jungle, most players are running an 18-12 page, taking the Fervor of Battle as their keystone. Now, some people are running Stormraider Surge on Ez jungle, but I think Fervor is just better, mainly because the reason you're picking Ezreal jungle is to be aggressive in the early game, and by taking the Fervor tree, you're gonna just do a lot more damage in the early game. If you are stacking that Fervor, then it's gonna allow you to outduel the enemy jungler a lot better than Stormraiders would. Stormraiders will allow you to kite a little bit better, but I don't think you really need to be able to kite better on Ezreal. You have your E, which is the gap close. If you have red buff, then that should really be enough to kite as long as you are a good Ezreal player. So that is going to be all for this video, guys. Hopefully this does give you a little bit better of an idea as to why Ezreal jungle is seeing a bit more play recently and to why it's a somewhat viable pick in this patch. I definitely don't think it's a top tier jungle pick by any means. It's a viable pick, but it still gets outclassed by a lot of the other junglers in the game. So for solo queue, unless you're really confident in your Ezreal play, then I would just be playing the other junglers over this pick, but it's definitely a fun pick to play around with, and it's a viable pick if you know how to play it well in the early game. So that being said, guys, if you did enjoy the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you have yet to already, and I will see you in my next video.